Staten Island, New York, October 29, 2012. Hurricane Sandy. The power went out first. In Great Kills, Staten Island, the lights failed early that night, hours before the storm reached its peak. Televisions went black. Phones lost signal. The neighborhood fell quiet in a way it rarely did. Connor Moore was 4 years old. His brother Brandon was 2. Their home sat in a place that wasn't marked for evacuation. No warnings on the map. No expectation of flooding. As the wind grew louder and the rain began to drive sideways, their mother, Glenda Moore, made a decision. She would leave. She would drive the boys to her sister's home in Brooklyn. Somewhere inland, somewhere lit, somewhere safe. They got into the car and pulled away into the storm. At first, the road looked wet but passable. Then the water deepened. Not rainwater, something heavier. Salt water being pushed inland by force. The surge came faster than expected. The car stalled. Wind rocked the vehicle as water climbed around the tires, then the doors. Inside, the boys cried. Outside, the street no longer looked like a street at all. Glenda unbuckled them. Staying inside the car was no longer an option. She opened the door and stepped out, holding both children, trying to move forward through the darkness. The water was stronger than it looked. In seconds, the surge overtook them. Connor and Brandon were torn from her arms and carried away into the black water, gone before she could reach them again. When the storm finally moved on, Staten Island emerged changed. Entire blocks were flooded. Homes were destroyed. Debris lined the streets, and 2 children were missing. Search crews combed the area for days, through marshland, submerged roads, and wreckage left behind by the surge. Neighbors joined in. Police searched in widening circles. 2 days later, Connor and Brandon were found. They did not survive the storm. Their bodies were recovered not far from where the car had stalled, close enough to show how little time there had been. Hurricane Sandy would become one of the deadliest storms in New York City's history. But for Staten Island, the loss of 2 young brothers would come to represent something quieter and harder to accept. They hadn't been in an evacuation zone. They hadn't ignored an order. They had simply tried to leave. And that was all it took. The storm had shown how quickly safety could disappear, and how, in the dark, even the right decision can still end in loss. But Connor and Brandon were not the only ones the water reached that night. Hundreds of miles south, on a narrow strip of Texas coastline, another call would come through as a hurricane made landfall. This time, the voice on the line wasn't asking for help. It was saying goodbye. Dolores, Brookshire, Bolivar Peninsula, Texas, Hurricane Ike. September 12, 2008. On the Bolivar Peninsula, the sky darkened long before nightfall. Wind swept in from the Gulf, bending palm trees and rattling windows in homes that sat only a few feet above sea level. Bolivar was never built for storms like this. A narrow strip of land, exposed on all sides, with only a handful of roads in and out. When hurricanes came, people either left early or they stayed and waited. Dolores, Brookshire was 72 years old. As Hurricane Ike approached, evacuation orders were issued across the peninsula. Traffic backed up quickly. Gas stations ran dry. For some residents, leaving was no longer an option. Dolores stayed behind. As the evening wore on, the wind grew louder. The pressure dropped. Somewhere offshore, a wall of water was forming, invisible in the dark, but moving steadily toward land. That night, Dolores made a phone call. She reached a cousin. Her voice, according to later reports, was steady, not panicked, not rushed. She said she wanted to say goodbye. She said she loved them. She said she believed she was going to die, that the water was coming and she was going to drown. It was not a call for help. It was a farewell. As the line went quiet, Hurricane Ike came ashore. The storm surge arrived first. Water pushed across the peninsula in a wide, fast-moving sheet, tearing through neighborhoods with little resistance. Houses were lifted off foundations. Vehicles floated, then overturned. Entire blocks disappeared beneath the surge. In some places, the water rose more than 10 feet in minutes. When morning came, Bolivar Peninsula was unrecognizable. What had once been streets were now fields of debris. Homes were reduced to concrete slabs. Personal belongings, photos, furniture, clothing, were scattered for miles. Search and rescue teams moved in as soon as conditions allowed. Survivors were pulled from wreckage. Bodies were recovered. Lists of the missing were compiled, then revised. Dolores Brookshire's name did not come off those lists. Days passed, then weeks. Her final phone call was replayed in news coverage again and again. One of the clearest human moments to emerge from Hurricane Ike. A voice caught at the edge of the surge, speaking calmly about a death she believed was moments away. No confirmed recovery was ever announced. In the years that followed, Dolores Brookshire remained officially listed as missing, presumed dead. One of several people never accounted for after Ike's storm surge erased Bolivar Peninsula. There was no grave, no remains to bury, no final location to point to. Only a phone call, proof that she was there and then suddenly wasn't. But Hurricane Katrina created another kind of missing. People who didn't vanish in floodwater, but in the chaos that followed. For one mother, the search wouldn't begin in the streets or the debris. It would begin inside hospitals, shelters, and lists that couldn't agree on where her son had gone. Ernest Grapps, Louisiana, August 29, 2005. Hurricane Katrina. When Hurricane Katrina approached Louisiana, confusion spread faster than the storm itself. Hospitals rushed to prepare. Patients were moved. Records were hastily written, copied, and lost. Ernest Grapps was 46 years old. On August 29, 2005, just hours before Katrina made landfall, he was admitted to a hospital. He was alive, in care, indoors. But after the storm, none of that mattered. His mother, Dorothy Grapps, could not find him. Phone lines were down, hospitals were evacuated, patients were transferred without clear paper trails, sometimes moved multiple times in a single day. Families searched shelters, morgues, and missing person lists, hoping for a name, hoping not to see one. Ernest's name surfaced anyway, not on a survivor list, on a list of the missing. As days turned into weeks, Dorothy began to believe what so many families feared after Katrina, that her son had been lost in the disaster, swallowed somewhere between flooding wards and emergency evacuations. There was no body, no confirmation, only silence. Katrina created thousands of stories like this. People who were not seen again, not because they were swept away, but because the systems meant to track them collapsed. Ernest was alive, but no one could tell her that. For months, his name lingered among the unaccounted for, another unanswered question in a storm defined by them. Then, much later, the silence broke. Dorothy learned that Ernest had survived, that he had been transferred, that he had lived through the storm and its aftermath, unreachable, but alive. The relief did not come all at once. After so much waiting, even good news had weight. Ernest Grapps was not a disappearance caused by water or wind. He was lost in paperwork, broken communication, and a disaster that severed families from information as completely as it severed roads and power. For Dorothy, the storm ended the day she learned the truth. Her son had not vanished. He had simply been out of reach. And in Hurricane Katrina, that distance between knowing and not knowing was sometimes just as terrifying as the flood itself. And for many families after Katrina, that was the cruel lesson. The missing weren't always gone. They were just unreachable. But on the Texas coast, during Hurricane Ike, the water didn't just cut people off. It left behind a sight no one could explain away. Sandy D. Walton, Bolivar Peninsula, Texas, September 13, 2008. Hurricane Ike. By the time Hurricane Ike reached full force, the Bolivar Peninsula was already coming apart. The surge had moved inland under cover of darkness, tearing through neighborhoods that no longer had power, lighting, or any clear sense of direction. Roads disappeared first, then homes, then the landmarks people used to understand where they were. Somewhere on the peninsula that night was Sandy D. Walton. She was 54 years old. She lived in Gilchrist, a small coastal community where people knew each other by name, and where leaving animals behind during a storm was something many residents couldn't bring themselves to do. As Ike approached, Sandy went out to feed animals. It was a simple decision, a familiar one, the kind made without imagining what the next hour would bring. By nightfall, the wind was screaming across the peninsula. The water was already rising when the surge reached the golf course, a low-lying stretch of land with a small pro shop near the shore. At some point during the storm, Sandy reached that building. And there, in the chaos of wind and water, she was seen. Witnesses later reported a woman clinging to the rafters inside the golf course pro shop, high above the floor as the surge filled the structure below her. Outside, waves and debris battered the walls. Inside, the water climbed fast, swallowing everything that wasn't above it. It was a fleeting image, a human figure suspended in the wreckage, a moment burned into memory by the violence of the storm. Then, the water rose higher. When Hurricane Ike finally moved inland and the wind began to ease, Bolivar Peninsula was left flattened. Entire communities were gone. Gilchrist was nearly erased from the map. Search crews arrived to a landscape stripped bare. They found slabs where houses had been, boats carried inland, cars wrapped around debris. They searched the pro shop. They searched the golf course. They searched the surrounding wreckage. Sandy D. Walton was not there. Days passed, then weeks. Her name was added to the list of the missing, alongside others who had vanished during the search. Unlike some, there would be no recovery. No remains officially identified. No place to mark where she was last known to be alive. Only that image remained. A woman clinging to rafters in the dark, doing everything possible to stay above the water as the building around her filled and failed. Over time, Bolivar Peninsula rebuilt what it could. New houses went up, roads were cleared, life returned in pieces. But Sandy Walton did not. She remains missing, one of the people Hurricane Ike carried away without leaving an answer behind. And the next disappearance would not come from someone caught off guard. It would come from someone who knew the storm was coming and chose to stay anyway. James Denny Hurst, Fort Myers Beach, Florida, September 28, 2022. Hurricane Ian. James Hurst went by Denny. He was 72 years old, a sailor, a man comfortable with risk, someone who had spent decades learning how water behaved and how it could turn. His sailboat was named Good Girl. It was more than a vessel. It was where he felt steady, in control, at home. As Hurricane Ian approached Florida's west coast, the warnings grew sharper by the hour. Forecast models shifted east and west, then settled into something worse. A powerful storm aimed directly at the shallow waters and barrier islands around Fort Myers Beach. Evacuation orders were issued, bridges closed, traffic stalled. People packed what they could and left. Denny told his family he planned to stay. He believed the boat would ride out the storm better than anything on land. He had done this before. He trusted his judgment. To him, this wasn't recklessness. It was experience. On September 28th, Ian made landfall. The surge arrived with devastating force, pushing walls of water through Fort Myers Beach and into the back bays and passes. Marinas were ripped apart. Boats tore free and slammed into homes. The island vanished beneath wind and water. When the storm finally moved on, Fort Myers Beach was unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Streets were buried under sand and debris. The shoreline had been rewritten. Denny was missing. Search crews began working through the wreckage as soon as conditions allowed. They checked marinas. They checked canals. They scanned the water for overturned hulls and sunken masts. Some boats were found piled together inland. Others were located miles away. Some were never found at all. Good Girl was among those missing. Days passed, then weeks. As officials accounted for the dead and the displaced, Denny's name remained on the list of the unaccounted for. He became one of the last missing persons from Hurricane Ian, a single unresolved name as recovery efforts slowed and public attention shifted elsewhere. For his family, the waiting stretched on without answers. No confirmed sighting, no debris tied directly to him, only the knowledge that he had been on the water when the surge came through. Nearly 4 months later, in mid-January 2023, the search reached its end. Divers working in Matanzas Pass located a sunken sailboat resting below the surface. It was Good Girl. Inside the wreckage, they found Denny. His remains were recovered along with the boat, held underwater since the day Ian tore through the coast. The water had kept him hidden long after the storm itself was gone. With that discovery, Lee County closed its final missing person case from Hurricane Ian. Every person was now accounted for, every loss given a conclusion. But conclusions don't always bring clarity. Denny had known the storm was coming. He had listened to the warnings. He had made a deliberate choice to stay. In the end, experience offered no protection against a surge powerful enough to erase an island. Hurricane Ian did not take him by surprise. It took him anyway. And while Denny's story ended with an answer pulled from the water, the next one would unfold very differently. After another hurricane on the opposite side of Florida, a daughter would spend days believing her mother was gone, until she saw her face, alive and speaking, on the evening news. Muriel, Panama City area, Florida, October 10th, 2018. Hurricane Michael. Hurricane Michael came ashore fast, faster than forecasts had predicted, faster than many people had time to prepare for. When it made landfall near Panama City, it did so as one of the strongest hurricanes ever to hit the continental United States. Entire neighborhoods were shredded, power lines collapsed, cell towers went silent. In the hours after the storm, Florida's panhandle went quiet. Muriel lived in the Panama City area. When the winds died down and the skies finally cleared, her daughter, Casey Stacy, tried to reach her. She called, she texted, she waited. Nothing came back. At first, the silence felt explainable. Power was out across the region. Phone service was unreliable or gone altogether. But hours turned into days. Still nothing. News footage began to show the scale of the damage. Streets buried in debris, homes peeled open, entire blocks flattened. Casey watched the coverage, scanning every frame, wondering if her mother's house was still standing. She had no way to know. No call. No message. No confirmation that Muriel was alive. In the aftermath of hurricanes, this is how people disappear. Not always swept away, but swallowed by silence. Infrastructure collapses. Communication fails. Families are left guessing, filling the gaps with fear. For days, Casey believed the worst. Then, like so many answers after a storm, it came from an unexpected place. While watching national news coverage, Casey saw a familiar face on her television screen. There was Muriel, alive. Standing amid the wreckage, calmly speaking to a reporter for CBS Evening News, describing what she had lived through, explaining how she had weathered the storm. Casey didn't hear the words at first. She recognized the face. After days of believing her mother might be dead, the confirmation came not through a phone call or a rescue team, but through a television broadcast seen by millions of strangers. Muriel had survived Hurricane Michael. Somehow, in the chaos that followed landfall, she had been unreachable but unharmed. The same communication breakdown that convinced her daughter she was gone had simply cut her off from the outside world. The storm had not taken her. It had only hidden her. For Casey, the relief was overwhelming, a sudden reversal after days of dread. One moment, her mother was missing. The next, she was alive on national television. In disasters, survival stories are often quiet. They don't come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes they arrive by accident, flickering across a screen. Muriel's story offered a rare pause, a reminder that not every silence ends in loss. But the calm would not last, because some storm victims are not found alive days later. Some are not found for years, and some are found without a name at all. Nearly 2 decades after Hurricane Katrina, one woman would finally be identified, after spending years buried as someone unknown. Tonette Waltman Jackson, Mississippi, August 2005. Hurricane Katrina. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast, the destruction did not end when the water receded. Along the Mississippi coastline, storm surge poured into homes, overwhelmed neighborhoods, and left behind a different kind of aftermath, one measured not only in damage, but in unanswered questions. Tonette Waltman Jackson was one of the people caught in that chaos. During Katrina's flooding, she died. But in the days and weeks that followed, no one could say who she was. Her remains were recovered, but her name was not. With communication systems down, records destroyed, and families scattered across states, identification efforts were overwhelmed. Some victims were identified quickly, others were not. For Tonette, there were no documents, no immediate family connection, no clear path back to a name. She was buried as a Jane Doe. In some records, she was listed under a placeholder, a temporary label meant to be replaced once answers came. But the years passed, and that replacement never arrived. Katrina faded from headlines, recovery shifted into rebuilding, and the unidentified dead were quietly folded into history. Tonette remained unknown for nearly 20 years. She lay among other unidentified Katrina victims, her identity suspended in time, a life reduced to a case number and a grave marker that didn't speak her name. For families searching after disasters, this is one of the cruelest outcomes, not knowing whether someone is alive or dead, and not knowing where to look for them, even years later. In 2024, that changed. Advances in forensic science reopened cases long thought unsolvable. Investigators revisited Katrina-era remains using modern genetic genealogy, techniques that did not exist when the storm first hit. DNA was extracted, profiles were rebuilt, family trees were traced backward, then outward. Slowly, a match emerged. In May 2024, nearly 2 decades after Hurricane Katrina, Tonette Waltman Jackson was identified. Her name was restored. For the first time since the storm, she was no longer listed as unknown, no longer buried without recognition, no longer separated from her own history. The identification did not undo the loss. It did not return the years taken by uncertainty, but it ended something that Katrina had left unfinished. Tonette Waltman Jackson was no longer a mystery victim of the storm. She was a woman with a name, a past, and a place in the story of what Katrina took. And her case would not be the last. Because farther south, near New Orleans, another Katrina victim had waited just as long, buried among the unknown, her identity locked away for nearly 20 years, until one final piece of the past was brought back into focus. Dorothy Virginia Driggers Taquino, Arabi, Louisiana, August 2005. Hurricane Katrina. When Hurricane Katrina reached St. Bernard Parish, the water came fast. In Arabi, just downriver from New Orleans, storm surge poured into homes with nowhere to go. The neighborhood sat low, levees failed nearby, streets turned into channels, and houses filled from the ground up. Dorothy Virginia Driggers Taquino was 81 years old. She was inside her home when the water rose. By the time responders reached the area, the neighborhood was submerged. Many residents had fled. Others had not been able to. Inside one flooded house, Dorothy's body was found. But knowing that someone has died is not the same as knowing who they are. In the chaos after Katrina, identification was fragile. Records were lost. Families were scattered across the country. Morgues overflowed. Temporary systems replaced normal ones. Handwritten tags, photographs, personal effects logged without certainty. Dorothy's name did not make it through intact. She was buried among other unidentified Katrina victims at a memorial cemetery in New Orleans, a place meant to hold the unknown until answers could be found. Years passed. Katrina became history, then memory, then something people spoke about in anniversaries. But Dorothy remained there, unnamed, one of many people officially classified as unknown, despite having lived a full life before the storm erased its final chapter. Attempts to identify victims like her came and went. Early DNA efforts were limited. Records were incomplete. Leads ran out. Nearly 20 years passed that way. Then the work began again. Investigators reopened old Katrina cases, combining modern forensic techniques with renewed attention to details once considered too small to matter. Records, photographs, personal items, fragments of family history. Local reporting helped bring fresh eyes. Genealogical research filled gaps old systems couldn't reach. Connections were tested, discarded, tested again. Slowly, one of the unknown names began to resolve. In August 2025, Dorothy Virginia Driggers Taquino was identified. After nearly 2 decades, the woman buried without a name was finally known. For her family, the identification did not reopen a wound. It closed one that had never been allowed to heal. It answered a question that Katrina had left hanging for almost 20 years. Dorothy was no longer an anonymous victim of a disaster. She was a person again, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had lived in Arabi and died in her home when the water came.